Hey there, amazing friends. I warmly invite you to join me on this exciting journey by subscribing to my channel, liking, commenting, and sharing my videos. Every like, comment, and share brings us closer together and fuels my passion to create more great content. Your support truly makes all the difference. Thank you for being the heart of this community. Beyond the sugar coating, unmasking the grim plot lines Disney never wants you to see. Have you ever emerged from watching a colorful Disney animated feature with a lingering sense that something deeper, something just out of sight, was glossed over or sweetened beyond recognition? Perhaps you've come across rumors that the original fairy tales and folklore underpinning certain classic Disney movies were far more unsettling than their on-screen versions let on. While The House of Mouse is known for its wholesome brand, musical numbers, and triumphant happily ever afters, the truth is that many beloved princesses, talking animals, and jovial sidekicks spring from centuries-old stories drenched in tragedy, cruelty, and a moral complexity that modern retellings mostly obscure. Here, we embark on a journey into the hidden roots of those narratives, ones that Walt Disney Studios either adapted so thoroughly as to change their entire tone, or quietly abandoned for fear of darkening the family-friendly aura that has become their hallmark. In doing so, we plunge into the shadowy corners of old folk tradition, the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, and even lesser-known authors whose tales revolve around curses, violence, and heartbreak. We'll reflect on what was lost in the translation to the big screen and what remains as hints that even the brightest fairy tale might harbor a bleak undercurrent. The seed of these sanitized stories lies in the original sources, medieval or early modern European texts, themselves based on still older oral traditions that might date back centuries or even millennia. For example, while Disney's The Little Mermaid gave us a mermaid princess with an unshakable yearning for life on land, the Hans Christian Andersen story that inspired it was far crueler. In Andersen's tale, the mermaid's pursuit of a human soul exacts a horrifying cost. Every step she takes on human legs feels like treading on shards of broken glass, each footstep an agony meant to underscore the gravity of her self-sacrifice. And in that original text, the prince she loves does not choose her. The heartbreak leads to her dissolution. She turns into sea foam, with a faint promise that perhaps her soul will gain immortality after centuries of penance. Gone in the Disney version is the existential torment over the nature of a mermaid's afterlife. Gone is the anguish of feeling each step as a stab of knives. Instead, we see a cheerful protagonist who triumphs by defeating an underwater villain and winning her prince's heart in a happy montage. That shift in tone is the difference between an existential parable on souls and sacrifice and a breezy cartoon romance. The original has a haunting quality that underscores how longing can devour us from within, while the adaptation offers an uplifting moral about bravery and following your dreams. Perhaps the most commonly cited example of Disney's sugarcoating is Cinderella. The final version that made it to the screen is indeed beautiful. A timid but virtuous girl endures cruelty from her stepfamily, meets a fairy godmother who helps her attend a ball, and eventually finds love with a charming prince. The stepsisters merely appear comedic or petty, their comeuppance mild. But in the older Brothers Grimm retelling, Aschenputtel, the story glints with brutal detail. The stepsisters, desperate to fit into the slipper, carve their own feet. One slices off her toe, the other her heel, hoping to pass as the rightful bride. Blood seeps from the shoe, exposing their ruse. Moreover, in some versions, the stepsisters suffer a grotesque punishment when birds peck out their eyes, leaving them blind in the final lines. This savage retribution might strike modern audiences as shockingly out of place, yet it was once an acceptable moral. Cruelty begets cruelty, and the wicked pay in bodily harm. Disney's adaptation omits these harsh comeuppances, subbing them for comedic foibles that culminate in a lighter resolution, presumably more palatable for children. So the horror of bodily mutilation, once integral to the moral lesson, disappears into a pastel swirl of singing mice and a whimsical pumpkin carriage, leaving behind only mild rivalry. Snow White's transformation from a Bavarian folktale to a cheerful musical likewise demonstrates the drastic rewriting. The fairy tale collected by the Grimms features a stepmother who orders huntsmen to retrieve Snow White's lungs and liver, in some translations, the heart, which she then cooks and eats, believing they belong to her rival. In older variants, an ogre or demonic twist also emerges, and the stepmother's punishment is to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she perishes, a scene too gruesome for the gentler Disney version. Walt Disney's 1937 film, widely regarded as a pioneering full-length animated feature, replaced gore with comedic dwarfs and a purely romantic conception of the poison apple scenario, culminating in a kiss of true love that breaks the spell. The original text is bleaker, emphasizing a primal hatred that demands literal consumption of one's foe. The sanitized version leaves only hints of peril in the Queen's black magic, overshadowed by melodic birds and forest animals that rescue or cheer the heroine. But these divergences do not solely revolve around violence. Some revolve around moral complexity. Consider The Hunchback of Notre Dame, adapted from Victor Hugo's novel. Disney's version introduced comedic gargoyles, catchy songs, and a conclusive redemption that, while not devoid of drama, steered well clear of the crushing tragedy in Hugo's text. The original ends in heartbreak upon heartbreak. Esmeralda is wrongfully executed. Quasimodo, bereft of love or acceptance, vanishes and eventually meets his fate in a final heartbreak that underscores the cruelty of society. Disney's adaptation does keep some darkness, Claude Frollo's obsession with Esmeralda, for instance, but it restrains the deeper social criticism and unflinching bleakness found in the novel. The theme of a monstrous but pure of heart hunchback might remain, yet the raw bitterness of Hugo's condemnation of medieval society dissolves into a more workable conclusion of acceptance and personal triumph, far less bleak. Yet perhaps it's not surprising that these cautionary, sometimes savage elements were toned down. The impetus behind many older fairy tales was to pass moral lessons or to psychologically navigate children's fears via symbolic horrors. In medieval or early modern contexts, an environment fraught with real diseases, abrupt wars, or precarious daily life, folk stories had to match that reality in severity. Meanwhile, Disney aimed for wide family-friendly entertainment in a modern era. The brand's commercial imperative is to soothe, amuse, and inspire, not to subject children to the raw edges of plague, betrayal, or cannibalism. So we see not only toned-down violence, but also a shift in philosophical outlook, from cautionary, morally ambiguous narratives to affirmations of positivity. The cost, some argue, is that the stories lose nuance, moral complexity, and a direct confrontation with death or suffering. For instance, the original Sleeping Beauty had variations in which the princess was assaulted or awakened under disturbing circumstances that speak to archaic views on consent and fate. Disney's version, while still containing a wicked curse and a shocking infiltration of the castle, remains squarely a love story about purity conquering evil. Of course, the question arises, do these grim, older elements serve any constructive role for children? Many child psychologists note that older fairy tales were once a means to personify intangible fears or to create safe frameworks in which to discuss moral wrongdoing. A violent punishment or shocking event might have taught moral cause and effect in a direct manner that resonated with a historically precarious lifestyle, In modern societies, with different standards of child-rearing, we might see that brand of brutality as excessive or traumatizing. Yet one wonders if an over-sanitization robs the tale of its deeper allegorical power, turning it into mere entertainment devoid of genuine caution or reflection. For instance, if Little Mermaid is turned from a meditation on unrequited love and existential longing into a comedic adventure with undersea crab sidekicks, do we miss the deeper dimension about the cost of sacrifice and illusions of romantic destiny? Disney's Beauty and the Beast also strays from older incarnations, albeit not as dramatically violent. The original tale had a beast who was not a gentle, misunderstood creature, but rather a symbol of captivity and uneasy bargains. Some older narratives had Belle's father ignoring caution, eventually leading Belle to become a sacrifice in a dark forest domain. Over centuries, the story softened. The moral that love can see beyond appearances remains, but the frightening captivity aspect, or the potential for real harm, is largely overshadowed by comedic living teapots and a grand waltz in a shimmering ballroom. The fear-laden premise that a monstrous other might hold you against your will shifts into a mild comedic frisson overshadowed by romance. Even so, the film retains enough tension to remind us that this tale has some primal kernel of fear at its heart. Then there are the lesser-known old stories that Disney either never adapted or scrapped early in development, presumably because their content defied even minimal sugarcoating. Tales involving kidnapping, curses that revolve around cannibalism, or horrifying transformations that end in death appear scattered throughout European, Middle Eastern, or Asian folklore. We can glean from pre-production sketches or from rumor that the studio toyed with adapting certain extremely old myths but dropped them. Some say the animators tested a concept for the Snow Queen decades before Frozen, but discovered the original Hans Christian Andersen version was too grim. The kidnapping of Kay, the splinters of an evil mirror lodging in his eyes and heart, the existential dread about losing empathy in a world turned to ice. In the final iteration of Frozen, the comedic snowmen, rousing songs, and themes of sisterly love overshadow the bleak undertone of the original. This pattern repeats. The seed remains, but the arcs are thoroughly reimagined to produce a triumphant final note. Yet ironically, one might argue that even Disney can't fully erase the darker underpinnings. Glimpses of genuine horror or tragedy remain in subtext, whether in the traumatic backstories of protagonists, like Elsa's repressed trauma, Mona's existential call to save her island, or Rapunzel's abduction. The real difference is that in Disney's domain, all can be resolved, usually by the virtue of personal growth, comedic sidekicks, and defanging the original threat. Meanwhile, if we read the source material, we see that sometimes the protagonist meets a dire end, or the comedic sidekicks never existed, or the villain emerges as a symbol for unstoppable tragedy. The tension between these older, savage narratives and the sanitized versions might reflect how modern culture demands positivity and brand synergy. Nevertheless, criticisms persist. Some wonder if the sanitizing approach might belittle children's capacity for understanding deeper complexities or navigating moral gray areas. Are we shortchanging them by never letting the wolf truly devour Red Riding Hood? The Grimms had a huntsman gut the wolf to release Granny in a near-horrific comedic twist, but older versions left a decidedly bleaker resolution. Are we stunting potential emotional resilience by not exposing young minds to a certain dose of fear or sadness in a structured context? These questions highlight the educational or psychological dimension behind grim plotlines, which Disney avoids. Then again, the counterargument is that life supplies enough real heartbreak, and letting fairy tales end in happiness fosters hope. The conversation thus remains nuanced, echoing broader debates about how we craft children's media in a modern era. By unmasking these plot lines, we unearth the pulsing roots behind each bright facade. Cinderella's stepsisters maimed themselves. The Little Mermaid dissolved in foam. Snow White's adversary was forced into red-hot iron shoes. We discover Pinocchio, adapted from Carlo Collodi's story, had original chapters depicting the puppet as quite malicious, with horrifying punishments. Even Bamba's source novel delved more deeply into the cruelty of the forest and raw violence than the sweet film that traumatized a generation primarily with a single gunshot. The reality is, behind almost every Disney staple, there lingers a far less comedic tradition. For those who suspect that modern reimaginings have lost a certain raw potency, a journey back to these roots can be both enlightening and disquieting. The older tales remain intense allegories about consequences, about the nature of wickedness or misfortune, or about the relentless tension between desire and moral codes. They present a moral universe where actions truly have dire outcomes, unsoftened by comedic relief. And so we stand at a place that sees the bright illusions of Disney musicals contrasted with the savage authenticity of archaic storytelling. The tension underscores how culture evolves. Once, these stories were told around fires, cautioning children against real dangers, strangers in the forest, moral lapses that lead to cosmic punishment, the fragility of social ties. Today, we crave narratives that comfort and inspire. The question arises, have we lost something essential in ditching that brutal clarity? Or have we simply adapted to a gentler worldview in which cruelty needn't overshadow imagination? The answer might lie in how these films still move us. Because even in a softening, Disney retains a spark of mythic resonance, some primal chord that has echoes in older folk traditions, bridging centuries of narrative metamorphosis. All in all, revealing the grim plotlines that Disney never wants you to see is less an indictment of the studio than a reminder of the persistent tension between commercial, family-oriented entertainment and the timeless ferocity of the original tales. Their horror and moral severity provided meaning for societies that contended daily with abrupt tragedy and ephemeral joys. Now we prefer to watch a joyous waltz in a castle or sing along to comedic sidekicks, but the older cautionary shadows remain, not fully erased. They lurk in the corners of these retellings, leaving ephemeral questions and uncanny feelings. Perhaps in gleaning them, we reconnect with the raw fear and wonder that shaped our ancestors' psyches, a humbling acceptance that, while the cartoon may end in a jubilant wedding, the primal forest from which the story sprang is dense with night and prowling wolves.